The morning Jennie Ralston collapsed against Paul Merritt's fence post. She had been walking for 2 days straight with nothing but a half-empty canteen, and a prayer she was no longer sure God was listening to. The year was 1874, and the high country of Colorado Territory was not a forgiving place for a woman alone. The mountains that rose in every direction were magnificent and terrible in equal measure, their granite shoulders draped in the last of the autumn snow, their valleys still wrapped in the purple shadows of a dawn that had not yet fully committed itself to arriving. The pines were thick and dark and smelled of cold resin, and somewhere far below, the Cimarron River was running fast with snowmelt. Jennie had heard it all through the night, that distant rushing sound, and she had told herself it was the sound of something ahead, something worth walking toward. She had been wrong about that, just as she had been wrong about Gerald Holt, just as she had been wrong about trusting a man who smiled too wide and spoke too fast and had, in the end, taken everything she owned and ridden south without a word of farewell. She did not know whose property she had wandered onto. The fence line appeared out of the gray morning mist like a sentence written in the language of civilization, 4 strands of wire strung between posts that had been sunk deep and true, the kind of fence that told you the man who built it meant to stay. She had followed it for perhaps a quarter mile, stumbling in the frost-stiffened grass, her boots soaked through, her wool coat doing little against the mountain cold that had settled into her very marrow. And then her legs had simply stopped working in the way that legs sometimes do when a body has been pushed past every reasonable limit, and she had sat down hard against the nearest post, and the darkness behind her eyes had risen up like a tide and taken her under. She did not feel the blanket when it was set across her shoulders. Paul Merritt moved quietly for a man of his size. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches in his stocking feet, and carried the kind of weight in his shoulders that came from 15 years of felling timber, hauling stone, and wrestling this particular piece of Colorado into something that resembled a home. He was 31 years old, dark-haired, with a jaw that might have been carved from the same granite that made up the peaks above his valley, and hands so calloused that they felt like leather when they moved across the rough-hewn surface of the barn door each morning as he pushed it open. He had been out before first light that morning because one of his 2 horses, a cantankerous gray mare named Duchess, had been restless in the night, and in this country restless livestock usually meant a mountain lion working the tree line. He had taken his rifle, pulled on his coat, and gone out into the blue-gray dark without lighting a lantern, preferring to let his eyes adjust to the natural light, which was something the mountains had taught him to do. He had not expected to find a woman sleeping against his fence. He stood for a long moment simply looking at her, the rifle lowered at his side, his breath rising in a small white cloud before him. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark copper-colored hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been set in, and now lay tangled across her cheek and shoulder. Her coat was a deep green wool, the kind a woman from a town would wear, not the kind a mountain woman would wear, and it was thin for this altitude and this time of year. Her cheek was pressed against the fence post, and even in the dim light he could see the raw red mark the rough wood had left against her skin. She was breathing. He confirmed that first, watching the slight rise and fall of her shoulders. She was deeply asleep, the kind of sleep that comes after genuine exhaustion, not the unconsciousness of illness or injury. He went back to the cabin. He took the heavy wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed, the one his mother had sent from Missouri 3 winters ago, and he carried it back out across the frostbitten yard and draped it very carefully across her shoulders, tucking it in at the side so the wind could not lift it away. She stirred slightly when he did this, a small sound escaping her lips, but she did not wake. He did not go back inside. He found himself unable to simply leave her there alone, not with the mountain lion possibility still hanging in the air, not with the cold still pressing down from the peaks. He settled himself on the ground some 10 feet away, his back against another post, and he set his rifle across his knees and he waited. He watched the sky change. That was one of the things he had come to love about living this high, the particular ceremony of dawn in the mountains, the way the darkness did not simply lift, but rather transformed through a series of impossible colors, purple to indigo to a cold gray-green to a pink so tender it seemed almost wrong for this hard country. The first birds began to speak in the pines. Duchess had calmed down, and he could hear her shifting weight in the barn, the familiar sound of a horse deciding that morning was acceptable after all. And still the woman slept, small and still under his mother's blanket, the copper of her hair catching the first real light. It was past full sunrise when she finally stirred. He watched her come awake the way a person does when they are in an unfamiliar place, the slow, confused emergence from sleep, the sudden sharp awareness. She sat up straight, the blanket falling from one shoulder, and turned her head and looked at him with eyes that were the color of good amber whiskey and wide with alarm. He raised one hand, palm out slowly, the way you might with a frightened deer. "I am not going to harm you," he said. His voice was quiet and rough from disuse, the way it always was first thing in the morning. He had not had reason to speak to anyone in 11 days. "You were sleeping against my fence post. I put a blanket on you." She stared at him for a long moment, reading his face with the particular intensity of a woman who had learned, maybe recently, that a man's face was worth studying carefully before you decided anything. She pulled the blanket tighter around her own shoulders rather than letting it fall, which he thought was the sensible thing to do given the temperature. "Your fence," she said. Her voice was rough with exhaustion, but there was something clear and direct underneath it. "My fence," he confirmed. "My land, my blanket." She looked down at the blanket and then back up at him. "How long have you been sitting there?" "A few hours." Something shifted in her expression at that. The alarm did not entirely leave, but it moved aside slightly, making room for something else, something she was not entirely sure she had the energy for right now. "You just sat there." "I was not going to leave you alone out here," he said simply. "There is a mountain lion working the high country." And the temperature was dropping. She was quiet for a moment. She looked out across his land, which even in early morning, even in the bare bones of late autumn, was something to look at. The valley stretched below them, golden with dead grass and dotted with stands of aspen that had long since dropped their leaves. The mountains beyond were bone-white and majestic, and the sky above them was the pure hard blue that only the high country could produce. "I did not know I was trespassing," she said. "I followed the fence because it seemed like it led somewhere." "It does," he said. "It leads to my cabin." He paused. "Are you hungry?" Jennie Ralston looked at this large, quiet man sitting on the frozen ground with a rifle across his knees and a morning's worth of patience behind his dark eyes, and she made a decision that was part desperation and part instinct, and part something she could not have named if pressed. "Yes," she said, "I am very hungry." His name was Paul Merritt, and his cabin was not what she had expected. She had expected the interior of a bachelor's dwelling to be grim and unwashed, a place where function had entirely displaced any notion of comfort or care. What she found instead was a single large room that was spare but clean, with a plank floor that had been swept recently, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and radiated a heat so welcome she felt her eyes sting with relief, and a surprising number of books stacked in careful order on shelves he had built himself from pine planks. A rough table stood in the center of the room with 2 chairs, and there was a cast-iron stove against the far wall, beside a stack of dry wood that reached the ceiling. He put water on for coffee and sliced salt pork into a pan, and cracked 4 eggs from a basket near the stove, and went about the business of making breakfast with the quiet efficiency of a man used to doing things alone. She sat in one of the chairs at the table and held her hands over the heat of the stove and let herself thaw. "Where were you walking from?" he asked, not looking at her, turning the salt pork in the pan. She thought about how much to tell him. She decided on the truth, or most of it, because she was too tired for anything else. "Pueblo," she said. I had a situation that required me to leave in something of a hurry." He set a cup of black coffee in front of her without comment. She wrapped both hands around it. "I was traveling with a man," she continued, "because it seemed important to be clear on that point. He was supposed to be taking me to Gunnison, where I had work lined up at a boarding house. He took my money and my horse and most of my supplies and left while I was asleep 3 nights ago." Paul set the pan on the table between them and sat down across from her. He pushed the plate of eggs and salt pork toward her side and watched her begin to eat with the barely contained urgency of someone who has not had a real meal in days. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Cooking and cleaning. Mrs. Aldrich runs the boarding house there. I wrote to her in August." She paused to drink the coffee. "I had a reference from the hotel in Pueblo where I was working before." "Before the man with the horse and the money," he said. She met his eyes and something wry flickered in hers. "Yes, before him." His name, she had gathered, was Paul Merritt, and he had been living on this land for 4 years, having come up from Kansas after the war with a land claim and enough stubbornness to make something of it. He did not offer this information all at once, but rather in small increments over the course of that first morning, answering her questions in the same quiet, direct way he seemed to do everything. She learned that he had a younger brother in Salida who ran a blacksmith shop. She learned that he traded timber and occasionally hired himself out as a guide for survey crews working the high country. She learned that he had lived alone here for all 4 of those years, and that this was a choice rather than a circumstance, though he did not elaborate on that distinction. She told him her own story in the same careful installments. Born in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children, her father a farmer who had died of a fever in 1869 when she was 21, her mother having remarried quickly, and to a man Jennie found it impossible to live with, not for any dramatic reason, but simply because he was the kind of man who believed women were decorative inconveniences. She had gone west in 1870 with a woman friend named Clara Hobbs who had relatives in Kansas, and from Kansas she had gone to Colorado with a different job and a different plan and the specific restless optimism of someone who keeps believing the next place will be better. It had been, sometimes, and sometimes it had not. Gerald Holt had been a mistake made out of loneliness and misplaced trust. She did not say that in so many words. She said that she had been unwise and that she had paid for it, and that she was done paying for it now. Paul Merritt listened to all of this without interruption, and without the particular expression of pity she had learned to dread in people, that slight softening around the eyes that meant they had assigned her to the category of unfortunate woman and were already thinking of her differently. He did not look at her that way. He looked at her as if she were someone worth listening to, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. By noon she had dried out completely near the fire and drunk 3 cups of coffee and was feeling something that was not quite herself yet, but was considerably closer to it than she had been at dawn. She offered to wash the breakfast things, which he allowed, and while she stood at the dry sink working the pump handle and scrubbing the pan, she was aware of him moving around behind her, doing the ordinary business of a morning, checking something on the roof that had been concerning him, splitting a small amount of wood for the afternoon fire, going to check on Duchess and the second horse, a bay gelding he called River, and returning each time to resume whatever task had been set aside. He did not hover. He did not ask her what her plans were in the tone that meant he wanted her to leave. He moved around her the way a person moves around something that has been placed in the kitchen, not inconvenient but simply there, incorporated into the space. She thought about Gunnison. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich and the boarding house job. She had no horse, no money, and her boots were, she realized as she looked down at them, unlikely to survive another long walk in their current condition. The right sole was pulling away from the upper, and she had been holding it together since yesterday with the careful placement of her foot. She mentioned none of this while she was at the sink. He had gone out to check the water trough when she sat back down at the table and opened his Bible, which was sitting on the shelf nearest the fireplace, not to read it, but simply to have something to do with her hands while she thought. She had been wrong about quite a few things in the last several years, and she had a talent. She knew it and did not like it, for making the kind of decisions that looked reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in the rear view. She was trying now to think clearly, which was difficult because she was still tired, and because this cabin was warm, and because she had not felt safe in weeks. She was still sitting there when he came back in. He looked at her sitting at his table with his Bible in her hands, and he went to the stove and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and stood for a moment in a particular silence that she was already learning to read as the silence of a man organizing his thoughts. "Gunnison is 60 miles from here," he said. "Most of it is mountain terrain. Your boots are not going to make it." She looked down. "I noticed that. I have a supply run to make to Montrose in about a week and a half," he said. "That puts you closer to Gunnison, maybe 40 miles. I could take you that far." He paused. "In the meantime, there is a storage room off the back of the cabin. It is not comfortable, but it is private and warm, and I can put a cot in it." She looked at him steadily. "You are offering me a place to stay. I am offering you a practical solution to a problem that is partly my problem now," he said, with a slight roughness to his voice that she realized was not coldness but a kind of awkwardness, the particular awkwardness of a man who meant a kind thing and did not quite know how to make it sound the way he meant it. "You are on my land. I am not going to put you back out on it with broken boots and no supplies." She thought about pride. She had a great deal of it, and it had served her sometimes and failed her at others. She thought about the 60 miles of mountain terrain. "I can work," she said. "Whatever needs doing, cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever you need. I manage well enough. I am sure you do, but it would make me feel better about accepting your help." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. The first 3 days were careful and quiet in the way that two strangers learning the geography of a shared space are always careful and quiet. She learned that he woke before dawn, that he ate a plain breakfast without much interest in what it was, that he worked outside through most of the morning and came in for a midday meal and then went back out until the light failed, that he read in the evenings by the firelight, serious books mostly, a history of the Mexican territories, a survey text on Colorado geology, and once, to her surprise, a volume of poetry by a man named Walt Whitman. She cooked and cleaned and mended 2 shirts of his that had been sitting in a pile, clearly waiting for someone to address them. And she reorganized his larder with the professional efficiency of a woman who had worked in hotels and boarding houses and knew how to stretch supplies. On the 3rd morning she woke before him, which took some doing given his hours, and had coffee and salt pork and sourdough biscuits on the table when he came in from checking the horses. And she watched his face do something when he saw the table laid out and the steam rising from the cups, a small and unguarded thing, quickly put away, but she had seen it. She did not mention it. He showed her how to work the pump in the cold to keep it from freezing, and she showed him that his sourdough starter had gone wrong somewhere and needed to be thrown out and started fresh. And these small exchanges of useful knowledge felt like the beginning of a language they were building between them, something useful and honest, and without the particular weight of the social performances that Jennie had always found exhausting. On the 4th evening he sat across from her at the table after supper, and she was mending a tear in her own coat by firelight, and he was reading, and the silence was so comfortable that she noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you had gotten used to, a ringing in the ear that has finally stopped. She had been thinking about Gerald Holt less and less. She noticed that too. On the 5th day, there was a problem with the back fence line, a section of it down because a bull elk had apparently decided that wire was a personal affront to his dignity and had gone through it with considerable force. Paul went out to repair it in the morning and came back at noon looking tired and dusty, and said, without particular preamble, "I could use a second pair of hands this afternoon if you are willing." She had never strung wire before, but she was a quick learner and she had strong hands, and he showed her how to use the wire stretcher and how to wrap the strand around the post, and she did it without complaint and without drama. And they worked side by side through the afternoon, with the mountains enormous and present above them, and the cold air sharp with the smell of pine and approaching winter. And it was the most purely contented Jennie had felt in longer than she could account for. Walking back to the cabin as the sun dropped behind the western peaks and the temperature dropped with it, she said, "Do you ever think about going back east?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "No," he said at last. "I tried living in a town once. I was not suited to it." "What does that mean?" He considered the question as if it deserved actual consideration. "I think in the time it takes for a thing to be decided in a town," he said slowly, "I need to have already built it." She thought about that. "I think I might be something like that," she said. "Except that I have been living in towns long enough that I have forgotten how to trust the part of me that wants something different." He looked at her sideways in the failing light, and she felt the look as a physical thing, a warmth that was distinct from the cold air. They were back at the cabin by the time either of them spoke again, and the moment had passed into something held, something set aside to be considered later. She was beginning to collect these moments the way she used to collect river stones as a girl, not for any particular purpose, but because something about their weight and texture felt important. On the seventh day, a rider came up the valley. Paul saw him first from the window and went very still in the way she had already learned, meant he was assessing something. She came to stand beside him and looked out at the man picking his way up through the dried grass on a dusty roan horse, and she felt the particular anxiety of someone who has been somewhere safe and now suspects the outside world has arrived to complicate things. "Do you know him?" she asked. "His name is Webb Calvert," Paul said, and his voice had taken on a new quality, a flatness that was distinct from his usual calm. "He works land about 8 miles east of here. He is not a man I have much use for." Webb Calvert turned out to be 40 or so, lean in the way that hard men go lean, with narrow eyes and the particular manner of a man who had decided somewhere along the way that he was owed more than the world had provided. He rode up to the yard and called out a greeting, and Paul went to the door without haste and stood in the frame of it, and Jennie hung back near the fireplace. The conversation carried clearly through the open door. Calvert had heard, he said, that Merritt had a woman staying with him. News traveled in the mountain country the way water found its level, Jennie supposed, through hidden channels she could not see. Calvert spoke about the woman herself in the third person, as if she were a subject of community concern rather than a person who might be listening. He said something about a woman traveling alone being a sign of loose character, a phrase that made Jennie's jaw tight. Paul Merritt's voice came back very quiet. "She was in trouble and I gave her shelter. That is the whole of it. I would say that is a fairly plain thing." "Just checking on the situation," Calvert said, with a casualness that did not quite convince. "Folks have been talking." "Let them," Paul said. And then he said nothing else, and after a moment Calvert turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Paul came back inside and did not immediately speak. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long and was probably cold and drank it anyway. "I apologize for that," he said. "Some men in this country think that whatever happens within a day's ride is their business." "It is not your doing," Jennie said. She felt the injustice of it keenly, the easy way a woman alone became a subject of speculation and judgment, the way a man's generosity became evidence of scandal when a woman was involved. She had navigated this particular current before. "Has it made things difficult for you?" He looked at her with something like surprise. "No. Has it made things difficult for you?" She thought about it. "Not more than the usual kind," she said. "I am accustomed to the fact that the world has opinions about women who travel alone." "That is a polite way to put it," he said. She smiled slightly. "I am occasionally polite." He looked at her, and something in the look was different from the looks before, warmer at the edges, and she felt it settle into her chest like the heat from the fireplace, steady and deep. That evening, he brought out a checkers board from somewhere, and they played 3 games by firelight. and he beat her handily on the first two, and she won the third by a margin that she suspected he may have engineered, though he denied it with a completely straight face, and the cabin was filled with the quiet sound of laughter for the first time since she had arrived. She was aware, lying on the cot in the storage room that night listening to the wind find the corners of the cabin, that she had stopped thinking about Gunnison in the same urgent way she had been thinking about it. She had been holding Mrs. Aldrich and the boarding house job in her mind like a lifeline, the thing she was moving toward, the proof that she had a destination. But the urgency had loosened somehow, the way a fist unclenches when the thing being gripped is no longer necessary. She did not know what to do with that loosening. She folded it up and set it aside and went asleep. On the 9th day, something happened that she had not planned on. She had been carrying water from the pump to the trough in the yard, 2 heavy buckets at a time, because Duchess had decided to dump the trough the previous evening with characteristic perversity, and Paul was up on the roof checking the shingles before winter fully set in. She was on her 3rd trip when her right boot, the one with the failing sole, finally gave out completely, the sole separating from the upper in a definitive split that sent her stumbling sideways in the yard. She caught herself on the fence, the near one, the one she had first found and followed to this place, and the water went everywhere and she stood there ankle-deep in the muddy cold splash of it, the useless boot in her hand, and she did not cry. She had not cried through any of this, but something in her chest performed a kind of quiet collapse. He had seen it from the roof. She looked up and he was looking down at her, and before she could say anything about it being fine, he was already coming down the ladder with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided to do something. He looked at the boot in her hand. He looked at her wet foot in its soaked stocking. "Come inside," he said. She opened her mouth. "Come inside, Jennie," he said again, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his low voice did something unexpected to the air between them. She went inside. He found a pair of thick wool socks of his own and set them by the fire to warm, and he sat down across from her and he looked at the boot she was still holding and he said, "I have some leather and tools. I can resolve that if you give me a day with it. You can cobble boots. My father was a cobbler," he said. "I know the basics." She handed him the boot. He turned it in his large, careful hands and examined the damage and nodded, and she sat there in one sock and one bare foot feeling both ridiculous and entirely at ease, which was a combination she could not have predicted but was discovering suited her. "Your father was a cobbler," she said, "and you became a mountain man." Something like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, disappointed him considerably. "Did you?" She pulled on the warm wool sock he had set out for her. "Was he unkind about it?" "No, just quiet on the subject in the specific way my father went quiet when he disapproved of something. He set the boot down on the table. He died in '71. We never quite resolved it. I think about that sometimes." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about things like that too," she said. "Things left unresolved." He looked at her. "Your father, a little, mostly just the feeling that life has been happening to me rather than the other way around." She looked at the fire. "I am 26 years old and I have been moved around this country by other people's plans and other people's mistakes and my own willingness to go along with things that did not suit me, and I am tired of it." He was looking at her with complete attention, the kind that did not demand anything but simply received, and it was the kind of listening she had rarely experienced from anyone. "What would suit you?" he asked. The question sat in the warm air between them like a gift she did not know if she was allowed to open. "I do not entirely know yet," she said honestly, "but I think it involves mountains." The silence that followed was not the silence of a moment that had passed, but of one that was still present, hovering, waiting. Paul picked up her boot and took it to the shelf where he kept his tools, and Jennie looked at the fire and her pulse was doing something she did not instruct it to do, and she thought that she had better be very careful, because she was not in a position to be uncareful, And because this man had been kind to her in the uncomplicated way of someone who did not expect anything in return for it, and she did not want to misread that, or read too much into a warm cabin and wool socks by a fire when you had been cold and frightened for days. She resolved to be sensible. She lasted 2 more days at being sensible. It was the reading that undid her in the end. She had been looking at his bookshelf on the 11th evening while he was out checking the stock, and she had pulled out the Whitman volume and opened it more or less at random. And the poem she found there was one about longing and recognition, about finding in the world something you had not known you were looking for. And she was still standing at the shelf reading it when he came back in, and he looked at what she was holding, and his expression did the unguarded thing again. The small warmth quickly covered. "Do you like Whitman?" she asked. "I find him useful," he said, which was not the answer she had expected. "Useful?" He pulled off his coat and hung it on the hook beside the door. "He says things I have thought about but could not have put into words. That is what I mean by useful." She looked back at the page. "This one," she said. She read a few lines aloud, not performing them but simply sharing them, her voice quiet in the warm room. When she stopped, he was looking at her with an expression she did not quite know how to name, but that made her think of the dawn she had watched from his fence line on that first morning, the particular quality of a light that was becoming something. "Yes," he said quietly, "that one." The next day he took her riding on river, showing her the upper property, the timber stand that was the primary source of his income, the creek that fed his well, the high meadow that was bare now but which he described in summer with a precision of detail that told her he had spent considerable time simply looking at it and holding it in his memory. She rode behind him on the big bay because there was only one saddle that fit properly, and this meant she was close enough to feel the warmth of him and see the way he pointed out things in the landscape with the same kind of careful attention he gave to everything. He showed her a place where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods and the light came through in a particular way in the late afternoon, turning everything amber and gold, and he said, "I come here sometimes when I need to think clearly." "What do you need to think clearly about?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, watching the light in the water. "Currently," he said, with a deliberateness that was clearly costing him something, "about the fact that you are going to Gunnison in 3 days." She felt the words land with a weight that surprised her. "I am," she said, and then, carefully, "Is that something you need to think clearly about?" He turned on the horse to look at her over his shoulder, and the look was direct, and without any of the deflection she might have expected from him, and she thought that, whatever else Paul Merritt was, he was not a man who hid from the things that mattered to him. "Yes," he said, "simply that." They sat for a while longer in the amber light of the cottonwoods and did not say anything else, because it seemed that enough had been said for one afternoon, and the mountains around them were very large and very patient. That night she lay on her cot in the storage room and did not sleep for a long time and thought about practical things, which was the only way she had ever been able to think about impractical things. She thought about what it would mean to stay. She thought about what it would mean to go. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich in Gunnison, who was expecting her and had held a position for her and had been waiting since August. She thought about the weight of Paul Merritt's voice when he had said yes and looked at her in the cottonwood light. She thought about the morning she had woken up against his fence post and found a blanket on her shoulders and a man sitting 10 feet away in the frozen dark with a rifle across his knees, not going inside, not going about his business, just staying. She thought about that more than anything else. The next morning she came out to find him already at the table, not eating, just sitting with his coffee and his hands flat on the table, and he looked up when she came in and said, "I have been thinking." "So have I," she said. They were quiet for a moment, the fire talking in the hearth behind her. "I know that you have plans in Gunnison," he said, "and I know that staying here is not a plan. It is a circumstance that happened because you were in trouble and I had a fence post and a blanket. I do not want you to feel that you owe me something on account of that." She looked at him steadily. "I do not feel that I owe you anything," she said. "That is not why I have been thinking about staying." His hands on the table went very still. "Then why?" he asked, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with disuse. She sat down across from him, in the chair that had become her chair, in the way that things become yours when you have been somewhere long enough that they remember the shape of you. "Because I came to Colorado looking for something," she said, "and I have been looking in the wrong places, which is to say the places that other people pointed me toward. And I think the reason I sat down against that fence post instead of going around it or going back the way I came is that some part of me understood that whatever was at the end of that fence line was worth stopping for." He was looking at her with a directness that was almost physical. "That is a great deal to put on a fence post," he said very quietly. "And the man who built it," she said equally quietly. He stood up then, not in any rush, just standing the way he did everything, with a kind of deliberate gravity, and he came around the table and stood before her, and she looked up at him, and the morning light was coming through the east window, and it caught the dark of his hair and the careful expression on his face, and she thought that he was one of the handsomest men she had ever seen. Not in any obvious way, but in the way that things that are built well and used honestly acquire a beauty that is more interesting than the decorative kind. He put out his hand, not reaching for her but offering, his palm open, the large calloused hand that had set a blanket on her shoulders in the dark without waking her, and then sat on the frozen ground to keep watch. She put her hand in his. "I would like very much for you to stay," he said. "I am not a man who finds it easy to say things like that, but I think I would regret it for the rest of my life if I let you get on a wagon to Montrose without saying it." "You would have regretted it," she confirmed, and her voice was not quite steady, and she did not particularly try to make it so. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful, and she felt the weight of it all the way up her arm and into her chest where the quiet collapse had been, and found that the collapse had somehow in the intervening days built itself back into something new and different, something with better architecture. She wrote to Mrs. Aldrich in Gunnison that same afternoon, a letter that was honest and apologetic, and that explained the situation as clearly as she could without revealing more than was properly anyone's business. She told Mrs. Aldrich that she had found herself in circumstances she had not anticipated, and that she was grateful for the position that had been held but was no longer able to accept it. She felt the writing of the letter close one door with a definiteness that felt right. Paul took the letter to Montrose when he made the supply run, with Jennie beside him on the wagon seat, and she saw the town and its rough-edged energy and its muddy Main Street, with the eyes of someone who has been out of the world long enough to find it both fascinating and slightly overwhelming. She bought new boots with money Paul loaned her against the wages she would earn him back in cooking and management of the cabin stores, and she posted the letter, and they were back on the mountain road by afternoon. Coming back up through the pines, the wagon loaded with supplies for the coming winter, the mountains rising blue and enormous on all sides, she felt something she had not felt in so long she almost did not recognize it. She felt like she was going home. The weeks that followed had their own texture and their own complications. They were two people learning each other against the backdrop of a mountain winter that was arriving with intention. The first serious snow came in early November and transformed the valley into something that was beyond what Jennie had words for, a white silence so absolute and so beautiful that she stood in the doorway of the cabin for long minutes just looking at it. And Paul came to stand beside her, and they watched the snow fall together in the particular companionship of people who have begun to inhabit each other's silences. He was not an easy man in all ways. He had moods that were mostly quiet but occasionally not, times when something from his past, which he parceled out slowly and with consideration, sat on him like a weight and made him short in his words. She learned to read these moods not as rejections but as weather, things that came and passed, and she did not push at them but did not withdraw from them either, and he seemed to notice this, and to appreciate it in the way he appreciated things, silently but with an attentiveness that felt like reverence. She told him about Missouri and about her father, and about the years between arriving in Kansas and arriving at his fence post, more than she had told anyone, because he listened without organizing her story into categories. He already had prepared, without deciding what kind of woman she was before she had finished speaking. And he told her about his time in the war, which he did once and briefly, and with a flatness that told her it had cost him considerably, and about the brother James in Salida, who was both the best friend he had and the most irritating person he knew, and about the 4 years on this mountain that had given him back something the war had taken. In mid-November, James Merritt arrived from Salida. He appeared on a cold morning on a horse that was considerably better looking than its rider, a stocky, good-natured young man of 27 with his brother's dark coloring, but none of his gravity, who greeted his older brother with a thump on the back, and then turned to Jennie with an expression of undisguised delight and said, "So you are the woman who fell asleep against his fence post." "I did not fall asleep against it on purpose," Jennie said. "Well, no one does things on purpose that turn out this good," James said, and beamed at her with such genuine warmth that she liked him immediately and completely. James stayed 4 days, and in those 4 days managed to tease his brother relentlessly, eat enormous quantities of Jennie's cooking, help repair the barn roof, tell her 3 separate embarrassing stories about Paul's childhood that Paul bore with stoic patience, and make it entirely clear in the way of a younger sibling that he approved absolutely of the current situation, and considered it the best thing to happen to his brother in recent memory. On the last evening of James's visit, when Paul had gone out to check on the horses before bed, James sat across from Jennie at the table with his cup of coffee, and looked at her with an expression that was somewhat less joking than his usual. "He has been alone up here too long," James said. "I have been worried about him, not the practical kind of worried he can manage the practical fine, the other kind." "I know," Jennie said. "He is a good man," James said. "The best kind. He does not say things he does not mean, and he does not do things by half measures." "I know that too," Jennie said. James nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his coffee. When Paul came back in, nothing was said about what had been discussed, but something had been settled, some informal contract between brother and woman about the care of a man they both valued. James rode back to Salida the next morning in the thin winter sunlight, and Paul stood watching him go with the expression of a man who has just been reminded that he has people in the world. And Jennie stood beside him, and without thinking too much about it, she slipped her hand into his, and he looked down at their joined hands and then out at his brother's retreating figure, and he held on. December came with a serious cold that drove the temperature down to places that required the fire to be kept through the night, and they developed a rhythm around this. Paul waking at 3 in the morning to add wood and check the horses, and Jennie waking at 6 to have the coffee and porridge ready by the time the gray dawn came. The days were short and the snow was deep, and the mountains were the most beautiful things Jennie had ever seen, purely and absolutely, and she would stop in the middle of whatever she was doing and look out the window at them and be struck fresh each time. One afternoon in mid-December, Paul came in from the timber stand with a particular look on his face, a look she had learned to identify as the preliminary to something he had been thinking about, and he sat down at the table and folded his hands and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, it does not change anything about your welcome here." She set down the pot she was holding and gave him her full attention. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. He looked at his folded hands and then back at her. "I have been thinking about how to say this, and I have not found a better way than just saying it plainly. I have been alone a long time, and I thought it suited me, and I was wrong about that, or I was right about it, and then you came along and made it impossible to go on being right about it. I cannot imagine the rest of this going on without you being properly here, without your name being on whatever this place is, without it being yours as much as mine." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, snow was beginning to fall again, the fat, lazy flakes of a storm that intended to be gentle. "When I sat down against that fence post," she said, "I had no expectations beyond not dying in the cold. And then there was a blanket and there was you. And I have been thinking ever since about the kind of life I actually want as opposed to the kind of life I have been willing to accept." She paused. "I want to marry you, Paul Merritt. I want to stay on this mountain and build something that is mine and yours and built to last." He reached across the table for her hand the same way he had that morning weeks before, his palm open, and she put hers in it. And he looked at her with the particular expression she had collected and pressed into her memory like a flower in a book, the open, unguarded expression that was only for her. They were married in January of 1875 in the town of Montrose, before a circuit judge named Hargrove who had a cold and was brisk about the whole procedure, but who said the words with enough conviction that they felt properly said. James had ridden over from Salida and stood beside his brother, and a woman named Ruth Forsyth, who ran the dry goods store and had befriended Jennie on the supply run, stood on her side, and the four of them went to the hotel dining room afterward and had a meal that was not exceptional, but that felt like a celebration because of the company. Jennie wore a dress that Ruth had helped her find, a deep blue wool that was not a wedding dress in the traditional sense, but suited the occasion and the setting perfectly. And Paul wore his best coat and a new shirt, and James had insisted on a corsage of dried flowers from a woman at the hotel. And it was simple and true, and nothing like what Jennie had imagined weddings to be when she was a girl, and she liked it considerably better than what she had imagined. Riding back up to the mountain in the evening, the wagon loaded with a few special things, a quilt Ruth had given them, a set of proper china plates from James. The world was blue and white and entirely still, and the stars were coming out above the peaks. And Paul reached over on the wagon seat and put his arm around her, and she leaned against his side, and they did not say anything for most of the drive because there was nothing that needed saying. Winter deepened and they were snowbound for long stretches, and they learned each other in the close way that mountain winters force people to learn each other, the good and the complicated, and the things that required work. There was one significant argument in February, about a decision he had made regarding a timber contract that she felt he should have consulted her on, and the argument was sharp and honest and ended in the first real silence between them since she had arrived. A silence that was not comfortable, but that resolved after 24 hours into something that was ultimately stronger than the thing before it, because they both knew then that they could argue without it meaning the end of something. The spring came up the mountain in the slow, determined way spring comes to high country, fighting the cold every foot of the way and prevailing incrementally. And the valley turned from white to brown to the first tentative green, and Jennie was standing at the east window one morning, watching the aspens begin to show their small new leaves when she understood with a certainty that was both startling and absolutely unsurprising that she was going to have a child. She told Paul that evening, sitting across from him at the table after supper, and his face did the unguarded thing in a way that she had not seen before, something larger and more complex than the usual small warmth, something that moved through him visibly from his chest to his eyes. He stood up and came around the table as he had that December morning when he had asked her to marry him, and he crouched down in front of her chair so that he was looking up at her rather than down, which struck her as a particular and significant thing, and he took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the question that mattered most to him. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, and she loved him for it, for the willingness to simply say yes. "Good," she said. "Then we are both paying attention." He made her a rocking chair that sprang from timber he cut and shaped himself, taking longer with it than any project she had seen him undertake, measuring and remeasuring and sanding the wood with a patience she recognized as love in its practical form. He put it by the east window where the morning light came in, and she sat in it and read and watched the valley come alive, and felt the child growing in her with a sense of astonished gratitude that was entirely new in her experience. Webb Calvert appeared once more in the spring, riding up with two other men she did not know, and Paul went out to meet them in the yard, and she watched from the window, and whatever was said was brief and definitive, and the three men rode away, and Paul came back in with the particular settled expression of someone who has put a thing to rest. "What did they want?" she asked. "They wanted to know if I was interested in a land deal that would have involved selling the upper timber stand at a price that was insultingly low." He poured himself water from the pitcher. "I told them no. That was all they came about." He looked at her. "Calvert made a comment about you." She waited. "I told him," Paul said, "that my wife was an exceptional woman and that he was welcome to keep his opinions about her to himself or go elsewhere and express them, and that either way he was not to come on my property again without an invitation." "What did he say to that?" "Nothing useful," Paul said. "He left." She felt the familiar small heat of injustice, the persistent weight of living in a world where a woman's reputation was used as a tool by men who had no business handling it. But she felt also with equal clarity the weight of Paul beside her, the fact of the land outside that had her name on it now too, the rocking chair by the east window, the child coming. She had been moved around by other people's plans and other people's mistakes for long enough. This was hers. This valley, these mountains, this life. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me for that," he said simply. Their son was born in October of 1875. Exactly 1 year and 1 month after Jennie had collapsed against a fence post at dawn. He arrived in the manner of mountain babies, which is to say with considerable drama and very little assistance from anyone outside the cabin, because the midwife from Montrose was 3 hours out when the labor started in earnest, and Jennie was too far along by the time they could have fetched her. Paul was entirely present for all of it, more frightened than he had ever been in his life, and managing it by being absolutely useful. And when the baby finally announced himself with the kind of full-lunged displeasure that suggests a person with strong opinions about the world, Paul sat down on the edge of the bed with his son in his arms and looked at him with an expression that Jennie, lying back against the pillows exhausted and illuminated, thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. They named him Thomas James, Thomas for Paul's father and James for the brother who rode over from Salida when he heard the news and arrived with an impractical amount of candy and a wooden horse. He had made himself and a tendency to hold the baby for such long stretches that Paul had to actively reclaim his own son from his uncle's arms. Thomas was a boy of impressive appetite and strong will, which Jennie attributed partly to the altitude and partly to genetics, and he grew through his first year in the particular rapid way of mountain children, as if the clean air and the enormity of the landscape around him was an instruction to get on with things. Winter came again, Thomas's first, and Paul added a room to the cabin that fall, working through October and into November in the cold to get the roof on before the serious snow, and Jennie worked beside him on the parts she could manage and made sure there was always something hot waiting when he came in, and the room was finished and solid and well built, as everything Paul built was well built, and when the snow fell it filled it with a quiet that felt like promise. James came at Christmas with his own news. He had met a woman named Clara Whitfield in Salida, the daughter of a rancher, and he wanted his brother and sister-in-law. He called her that with a naturalness and warmth that still struck Jennie pleasantly, to meet her in the spring. He talked about Clara with the same helpless enthusiasm that Jennie had noticed in his voice when he talked about the things that truly mattered to him. And she watched Paul watch his brother and saw the quiet satisfaction in Paul's face, the contentment of a man whose world is going correctly. On Christmas evening, with Thomas asleep in his new cradle and James, and Clara's pending arrival discussed in happy detail and the fire burning well and the snow pressing gently against the windows, Paul and Jennie sat together in the two chairs before the hearth, her feet in his lap the way they had taken to sitting in the evenings, and the world outside was entirely white and silent, and the world inside was warm and true. "I have been thinking," Paul said, which was how he began most of the things that mattered. "Tell me," she said. "About that morning," he said. "When I found you." She looked at the fire. "What about it?" "I have thought about it many times," he said. "About the fact that I almost did not go out that morning. Duchess had settled down by the time I was awake, and I thought about waiting until first light." He paused. "If I had waited until first light, I might not have seen you until you woke up on your own and walked away." She considered this. "I would not have walked away. I would have knocked on your door. Would you?" She thought about the Jennie who had been sitting against that fence post, the frightened and exhausted and too proud Jennie who had been walking for 2 days because she could not admit she needed help. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Maybe not." He was quiet for a moment. "I sat on that frozen ground for hours," he said, "and I did not think about it as a sacrifice or a good deed. I thought about it as the only reasonable thing to do, but I have wondered since whether I would have sat there if you had not been you." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that even asleep against a fence post in the dark you were distinctly yourself. I could see it. The way you had your coat clutched in your sleep. The way you had not let go of your bag even unconscious." He looked at the fire. "I thought, whoever this is, she is someone who does not give up." Jennie felt the words move through her like the first warmth after a long cold. "I almost did," she said. "Give up. Not the dramatic kind, just the quiet kind. The kind where you stop expecting anything different." "I know that kind," he said. "I know you do," she said. Thomas made a small sound from the cradle, the pre-waking sound, and they both looked at him. And the look they exchanged over their sleeping son was the look of people who share something that cannot be adequately described because it is made of too many small true things. The spring of 1876 brought James and Clara up the mountain for the promised introduction. And Clara Whitfield was exactly what the stories had prepared Jennie for. A bright, direct woman with good hands and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, who took one look at the cabin and the valley and the mountains and said, "I understand now why he talks about this place the way he does," in a tone that contained both admiration and the faint competitive edge of a woman whose man had a beloved place that was not yet hers. Jennie liked her immediately and completely, and after 2 days the women had developed the easy shorthand of people who have recognized in each other a similar way of being in the world, practical and warm and possessed of a patience that had been learned rather than inherited. James and Clara were married that summer in Salida, and Paul and Jennie made the trip down from the mountain with Thomas, who was by then a walking and opinionated 9-month-old with strong feelings about horses and a fascination with his uncle's beard. The wedding was larger than Paul and Jennie's had been, Clara's family being both numerous and celebratory, and there was music and dancing in the street outside the church, and Jennie danced with Paul for the first time in the entirety of their acquaintance, discovering that he danced with the same deliberate, careful competence he brought to everything else, and that being in his arms on a dance floor in the warm Colorado evening was a very fine thing indeed. The land expanded with them. In the autumn of 1876, Paul negotiated the purchase of an adjoining parcel that extended the property down toward the creek and included a stand of timber that would more than double his seasonal income. He made this decision with Jennie's full consultation, spread the survey maps on the table on 2 successive evenings, and walked her through every aspect of it. And she had suggestions that were sensible and questions that were incisive, and he incorporated both before signing the papers in Montrose. And afterward she felt the expansion of the property in some physical way, as if the land itself had grown larger under her feet. Thomas walked fully and confidently by his first birthday and spoke his first clear word at 13 months, which was the word mountain, a fact that James refused to believe, and that Paul maintained solemnly was absolutely true, and that Jennie confirmed with the authority of a witness. In the winter of 1876, she wrote a long letter to her mother in Missouri, the first real letter, not the dutiful brief one she had been sending, but a true letter, telling her mother about the cabin and the valley and Paul and Thomas, and the way the light fell through the cottonwoods in autumn. Her mother wrote back in the spring, a longer letter than her mother had ever previously managed, expressing something that Jennie recognized with a kind of startled relief as genuine happiness on her behalf. The stepfather was not mentioned. The years had a shape to them after that, the particular shape of a life that has found its right geography. There were hard seasons. A drought in the summer of 1877 that made the water work grueling and killed a quarter of the grass. A winter the following year that was brutal even by mountain standards, and kept them snowbound for 6 weeks, during which time Thomas, now 2 and full of the energy of a child who has been cooped up far too long, reached a level of activity that required both his parents' full attention and considerable creativity. There were good seasons too. A timber contract in 1877 that paid better than any previous year. A summer in 1878 when the high meadow was so spectacularly full of wildflowers that Jennie brought Thomas up to see it, and they sat in the middle of it for an entire afternoon, while Paul worked the timber below and the mountains watched. She was carrying their second child through that wildflower summer, which she did not mind at all because pregnancy agreed with her physically, and the baby arrived in October of 1878 on a morning when the aspens were gold, and the air was clean and cold and perfect, and was a girl this time, dark-haired like her father and clear-eyed and furious at the world in the particular way of a person who had places to be. They named her Eleanor May, Eleanor for Jennie's grandmother who had been a formidable woman, and May because it was the name of the month Jennie most loved on the mountain even though the child arrived in October, and Paul, who had by this point fully embraced the idea that his wife's logic was its own consistent system, that he did not need to entirely understand, simply agreed. James and Clara came in November with their own news. Clara was expecting their first child in the spring. Jennie watched the way Paul received this news, the genuine unperformed joy he took in his brother's happiness, and felt the same thing she always felt watching him in moments like this, a deep settled warmth, the knowledge of a man's character that can only come from years of close observation. Thomas adored his sister with the passionate proprietorial love of a firstborn, and Eleanor, as she grew, tolerated his attentions with the amused superiority of someone who knew she had arrived into a position of power and intended to use it wisely. They were magnificent together, these two, in the specific way of mountain children who have the full run of a large piece of land and parents who trust them to learn the boundaries of it, which they did, and also very occasionally tested. The fence posts became a kind of landmark in the family's history. Thomas, when he was old enough to understand the story, asked to hear it repeatedly, the story of the woman who fell asleep against the fence post and the man who put a blanket on her shoulders and waited. He seemed to find in it something deeply satisfying, the way children find satisfaction in stories that explain the reason for their own existence. Eleanor preferred the part where her father sat on the frozen ground for hours and did not go inside, and would ask about it with an expression that suggested she was filing the information about her father's patients away for future use. Paul told the story differently than Jennie did. Jennie's version focused on the practical details, the 2 days of walking, the failing boots, the blanket's warmth. Paul's version was shorter and more essential. He said, "I went out in the dark and found what I had been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. And then I was careful not to disturb it until it was ready to wake up." Eleanor, at age 4, upon hearing this version, said, "What if she had never woken up?" And Paul had looked at his daughter with an expression of absolute seriousness and said, "Then I would have sat there longer." Jennie had been standing at the stove when he said this, and she had kept her back to the room for a moment because her eyes had done the thing they occasionally did, when he said something that went directly to the center of her, and she was not interested in giving him the satisfaction of seeing it, though the slight warmth in his voice when he said, a moment later, that supper smelled excellent, told her he had known. In the autumn of 1880, a survey crew came through the high country working for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, assessing possible routes through the mountains. Paul hired himself out as their guide for 3 weeks, and Jennie managed the property alone with Thomas, who was 5 and an absolute and enthusiastic worker when it suited him, and Alina, who at not quite 2 was largely interested in rocks and the dog, a large brown animal of uncertain ancestry that had appeared at the property the previous spring and been named governor by Thomas for reasons he could not fully explain. The survey crew stayed in camp and were largely respectful, with the exception of a young engineer from back east who was under the impression that a woman managing a mountain property alone was either in need of assistance or in distress. He arrived at the cabin one afternoon with what he clearly believed was the helpful intention of offering his presence. Jennie looked at him across the yard from where she was splitting kindling with an efficiency that required no commentary, with Thomas beside her doing the same with a smaller axe, and said, "I appreciate the thought. I have everything well in hand." The young engineer looked at the two of them, mother and son, both handling their respective axes with the unconscious competence of people for whom this was ordinary, and at the cabin behind them and the barn and the fence lines running clean and taut in every direction, and he said, "I can see that," and went back to his camp with the slightly revised understanding of mountain women that Jennie had provided free of charge. Paul came home from the survey job with new information about where the railroad was likely to go and what it would mean for the timber trade, which turned out to mean very good things, as the railroad's arrival in the region would open markets that had previously been inaccessible. He sat with Jennie that first evening of his return and laid out the information and the possibilities, and they talked it through by firelight while the children slept. And Jennie said that if the timber trade was going to expand significantly, they would need another horse and additional equipment. And Paul agreed, and they planned it together the way they planned everything, with the unhurried thoroughness of two people who had built something worth taking care of. She thought sometimes about the version of herself that might have arrived in Gunnison if the boots had held, if the cold had been slightly less, if she had found the fence post 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later. She thought about the boarding house and Mrs. Aldrich, and the life that would have been practical and manageable and entirely someone else's shape. She did not think about it with regret for that life, but with a kind of grateful amazement at the precision with which a life can pivot on the smallest hinge. A failing boot sole, a mountain lion's restlessness, a man who decided to go out before first light rather than wait until dawn. The fall of 1881 brought their third, and what would prove to be their last child, another boy, named William after no one in particular, which James found suspicious and Jennie maintained, was simply the name that suited the child's face, which was round and amiable and already inclined toward contentment. William arrived in September when the air was turning, and the mountain above the cabin was putting on its autumn performance of color, and he was from the beginning the most peaceable of the 3 children, which Paul said was God's method of balancing accounts after Thomas and Alina. By 1882, the property had expanded twice more, and the cabin had been extended and added to until it was properly a house, with 3 rooms for sleeping and a kitchen that was separate from the main room and a porch along the south side where you could sit in the afternoons and watch the valley and the light moving on the mountains. The porch had been Jennie's specific request, and Paul had built it with the same gravity he brought to all the permanent things, constructing it to last far longer than either of them would need it. She sat on the porch on a September afternoon that year, William in her lap, Thomas chasing something in the yard below, Alina sitting beside her on the bench with Governor's large head on her feet, and Paul coming up from the barn with his tools on his shoulder and the light behind him. And she thought that if she could hold one moment in amber and keep it against the dark that the world also contained, it would be a moment very much like this one, ordinary and full and completely, precisely right. He looked up and saw her watching him, and he stopped in the yard and looked at her for a moment from across the distance of the yard, and the look was the same one she had first seen in a dark morning above a fence line, the unguarded warmth, except that now it was not a small thing quickly covered, but something he wore openly, because he had stopped being careful about it a long time ago. Thomas looked up from whatever he was pursuing and looked at his father looking at his mother and said, with the frank curiosity of a 7-year-old, "What are you looking at?" "Your mother," Paul said. "Why?" "Because I like to," he said simply, and continued toward the house. Thomas considered this briefly, and then returned to his pursuit with the philosophical flexibility of a child who has been given an answer that is not interesting enough to argue with. And Alina made the sound she made when adults said things that were embarrassing, and yet she was secretly pleased by. And William, in Jennie's lap, grabbed a fistful of her hair with the uncomplicated enthusiasm that was his primary mode of engagement with the world. Paul came up onto the porch and set his tools against the wall and looked out at the valley and the mountains in their late afternoon light. And then he looked at her and the children and the dog and the house they had built, and his face had the quality of a man who has arrived somewhere he set out for and found it better than the map suggested. He sat down beside her on the bench, and she shifted William into the warm space between them and leaned her head against his shoulder, and the mountains stood above the valley in their ancient, enormous patience, and the light went golden and then red, and then the particular blue of a Colorado mountain evening, and all around them the land that was theirs held them in its broad, familiar arms. She had been walking for 2 days with nothing but a canteen and a prayer when she found his fence post. She had been at the end of things, or thought she was, which amounted to the same exhaustion. And something in her, some deep, undimmed instinct, had sat down and waited, had held still in the cold and the dark, and trusted that the stillness was not defeat but the pause before something worth waking up for. He had come out in the dark with a rifle and found her there and set a blanket on her shoulders and sat on the frozen ground and waited. That was all. That was everything. A blanket and a vigil and an open palm in the morning light, and the rest of it, all the rest of it, the years and the children and the house and the porch and the mountains and the life that was more completely hers than any life she had previously inhabited, had grown from that one act of careful and patient and utterly unpretentious love. She turned her face into his shoulder. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, William sandwiched happily between them, Thomas below calling up about some achievement with the thing he was chasing, Alina sighing the long-suffering sigh of an oldest daughter flanked by chaos. The mountains caught the last of the sun and threw it back in crimson and gold. Jennie Ralston Merritt closed her eyes and felt the whole of it, the solid warmth of her husband's arm, the weight of her smallest child, the voices of her older children in the failing light, the cold beginning to come down from the peaks as it always did in September, the smell of pine and cold stone and wood smoke, and underneath all of it, steady as the fence posts sunk deep in the mountain ground, the knowledge that she was entirely, completely, and permanently home. Paul pressed his lips to the top of her head, the way he had begun to do years ago and had never stopped. "Cold coming in," he said against her hair. "I know," she said. "A few more minutes." He did not argue. He held on. The evening star appeared above the western peaks, and the valley below filled slowly with shadow, and the house behind them was warm and lit, and there was nowhere else in all the vast and complicated world that either of them would have chosen to be.